The mansion stood silent beneath the midnight storm, lightning cutting across the sky as rain splattered against marble walls. Inside, whispers of power lingered in every ornate corridor. Anthony Moretti, the feared mafia kingpin, paced his study, cigar smoke curling above his head. He muttered, "They think they can touch me." A sudden crack shattered the silence, louder than thunder. His body collapsed across the polished mahogany desk, blood blooming across his shirt like spilled ink. The room froze in a chilling stillness, his lifeless eyes fixed on the chandelier above. A trembling hand crawled toward a buzzing phone. His lips curled in a final grimace as he typed, "It's done. The king is dead." Phone clattered to the floor. A shadow slipped from the doorway, leaving no trace except the lingering scent of gunpowder. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming like war drums against stained glass windows. Somewhere in the city, under neon lights, rival families would soon celebrate, not knowing this act was only the beginning of something far greater. The underworld had just been cracked wide open. The news of Anthony's death spread like wildfire across the city, whispered first in smoke-filled bars, then shouted in back alleys. Every crime family knew the balance of power had been destroyed in a single shot. Dominic Russo, the loyal consigliere, stood at the window of his penthouse, fists clenched as he growled. This was no accident. The phone on his desk buzzed relentlessly, allies demanding answers, enemies circling like vultures. Outside, neon lights flickered against sheets of rain, reflecting chaos that brewed in the underworld. The syndicate's foundations trembled, not from grief, but from fear. Everyone knew a war was coming. Somewhere in the shadows, a betrayer had pulled the trigger, and the consequences would spill across the streets in blood. Dominic knew one truth: whoever had dared strike the king had already set their eyes on the throne. The underworld would burn before this was over, and he would make sure to survive the fire. In a dim backroom of a downtown club, the lower-ranking soldiers gathered, faces pale beneath the flickering bulb. Marco Vitale, a young soldier with sharp eyes, whispered, "The king is gone. Now the vultures will feast." Fear thickened the air like smoke, every man clutching whiskey glasses they barely sipped. Loyalty wavered, and rumors spread faster than the drinks. "Who do we trust now?" another soldier muttered, eyes darting to the door. The old order had collapsed overnight, leaving the soldiers exposed to shifting tides of violence. Marco tightened his jaw, knowing survival meant choosing sides before dawn. But which side? In the mafia world, hesitation was death. A storm raged outside, yet the storm within was far deadlier. Across the city, Detective Sarah Miller received the call, her weary eyes narrowing as the words echoed. "Moretti is dead." The rain hammered against her cruiser as she drove through empty streets, sirens painting red streaks across wet pavement. Sarah said quietly, "This changes everything." For years she had hunted the syndicate, every lead slipping away in shadows. Now for the first time cracks appeared. But she knew better than to celebrate. A dead king only meant a war for succession, and wars left cities burning. Her hands tightened on the wheel, as determination surged through her veins. She was stepping into the fire, and she might not make it out. Yet this was her chance to expose the empire that had destroyed so many lives. She pressed harder on the accelerator, sirens wailing into the night. In a hidden room beneath a casino, the first whispers of betrayal surfaced. The Council of Capos sat around a long table, cigars glowing, tempers rising. Old men argued, each voice sharper than the storm outside. "We must strike back," snarled one, while another countered, "Trust no one." The air thickened with smoke and suspicion. Lorenzo, the eldest capo, leaned forward, his lined face grim. This was no rival's doing. This came from inside. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. Eyes shifted across the table, allies now potential enemies. The world Anthony had built was collapsing, not from an enemy's bullet, but from betrayal that cut deeper. Outside, thunder rolled like cannon fire. Inside, the seeds of war had been planted. The city pulsed with tension as Anthony's empire fractured. Dominic Russo summoned key lieutenants to a candlelit chamber, his voice steady but his eyes storming with rage. "Trust no one," he declared, each word slicing through the smoke-filled air. Shadows clung to the corners as soldiers exchanged nervous glances, knowing betrayal could sit at the same table. The rain outside beat a relentless rhythm, echoing the unease within. Every ally had the potential to become an enemy, every promise just a mask hiding a blade. Dominic leaned forward, his fists slamming against the table. "We will find the hand that pulled the trigger." Yet even as he vowed vengeance, he could feel the weight of unseen forces shifting against him. The Underworld was a chessboard, and tonight the first moves had been made. In a rain-slick alley, Marco Vitale met with a rival soldier under flickering neon. The air reeked of gasoline and betrayal. Marco said, "We're dead men if we choose wrong." His companion replied coldly, "Then choose fast." Both men knew hesitation could cost them their lives. The power vacuum left by Anthony's death turned every corner of the city into a battlefield of whispers. Loyalty had become a currency no one could afford. Marco clenched his jaw, weighing which family to serve, his heart pounding as headlights cut across the alley. The world had shifted overnight, and survival now depended on abandoning honor. For Marco, the line between ally and enemy was disappearing in the rain. Detective Sarah Miller studied crime scene photos, spread across her cluttered desk, the neon from outside spilling through blinds. She whispered, "This wasn't random. This was planned." Her partner leaned on the wall, skeptical. Sarah's eyes burned with determination, her mind connecting fragments others dismissed. The blood-stain patterns, the discarded shell, the message, all pieces of a puzzle pointing to a betrayal from within. But her superiors wanted quick answers, not dangerous truths. She muttered, "They're already burying evidence." The system itself was compromised, corrupted by mafia hands. She realized the only way forward was to go rogue, to follow leads no one wanted uncovered. Her pulse quickened. She was stepping into darkness alone. Beneath the casino, Dominic confronted the enforcer, a hulking man named Victor, silent and expressionless as always. Dominic growled, "Find the rat and break him." Victor nodded once, his towering frame bathed in shadows. His reputation was carved from blood and fear, every man in the syndicate knowing his wordless efficiency. Yet behind his cold eyes flickered something unspoken, a burden of violence he could never wash away. He stepped into the storm above, trench coat whipping in the wind. The city trembled at his presence. For Victor, orders were simple, but every task chipped away at his soul. As thunder cracked overhead, he marched toward his next victim, haunted by ghosts no one could see. In a quiet diner at dawn, Sarah met an unlikely informant, Elena, a former rival Capo's widow. Steam curled from untouched coffee cups as Elena whispered, "They'll kill us both if they know." Her trembling hands betrayed her fear, but her eyes burned with anger. Sarah leaned closer, her voice low. "Help me, and I'll burn them all." Outside, the streets glistened from the storm, sunlight barely breaking through gray clouds. In this fragile truce, two women from opposite worlds found common ground in vengeance. Trust was impossible, yet necessity bound them together. For Sarah, this was the first crack in the Empire's wall. For Elena, it was the beginning of revenge long denied. The rain had eased, leaving streets slick with reflections of neon. Marco Vitale walked quickly through a deserted warehouse, his nerves frayed. He stopped at a rusted door where whispers awaited. Inside, a trusted ally sat in the shadows, but the air stank of deceit. Marco said sharply, "Tell me it's not true." The ally's smirk answered without words. Betrayal had a face now, and it was one Marco had once called brother. A revolver gleamed on the table between them, not aimed yet, but waiting. Marco's chest tightened, torn between rage and disbelief. In this city, trust was more lethal than bullets, and tonight he realized he had trusted the wrong man. The war was no longer about territory. It was about survival. Detective Sarah Miller stared at the crime board, strings of red thread connecting names and photographs. Her voice cracked as she muttered, "It's all connected." Every line pointed not to rival cartels, but inward, to the very core of the Moretti family. Her partner urged caution, but Sarah's resolve hardened. She whispered, "The killer isn't just close. He's blood." Thunder rolled outside as her gut twisted. This wasn't a war between families. It was betrayal born in the marrow of kinship. The realization struck like ice. The empire was rotting from the inside out, and soon the truth would devour them all. She pressed her palms against the board, fighting the tremor of dread in her veins. In a dimly lit chapel, Dominic Russo lit a candle, his face heavy with shadows. He murmured, "Forgive me, Father, for my sins multiply." But there was no priest in the confessional, only silence. His enemies drew closer, and whispers of betrayal pierced deeper. The candle flickered as though mocking him. He clenched a rosary, his knuckles white, but faith had no refuge here. For a man who had killed for loyalty, the realization was unbearable. Loyalty was dead. He whispered again, voice breaking, "Even family betrays." Behind the chapel doors, footsteps echoed faintly. Was it ally or executioner? Dominic knew only that God would not save him. Victor, the enforcer, stood over a trembling soldier in a rain-soaked alley, his shadow stretching across the wall. The soldier begged, "I didn't do it," but Victor remained silent, eyes cold as steel. His orders were simple: find the rat, break him. Yet as he raised his fist, hesitation flickered. The soldier's fear mirrored his own buried guilt. He had killed countless men, but each scream haunted him louder now. The storm raged above, wind whipping his coat as bloodlust battled conscience. For the first time, Victor wondered if the real betrayal was not from others, but from the life he had chosen. The soldier sobbed, awaiting death, while Victor's silence roared louder than thunder. At dawn, Sarah met Elena once more, this time in an abandoned rail yard. Trains rusted silent as Elena revealed a folder, her hands trembling. "He's closer than you think," she whispered. Sarah opened the files, her eyes widening at the photographs inside. Proof of secret meetings, coded ledgers, faces she never expected. Her heart sank. The betrayer wasn't just a soldier or a capo. It was family, orchestrating ruin from within. Elena's tears streaked her face as she murmured, "They played us all." The morning light broke weakly across the horizon, but for Sarah it carried no hope. The truth was poison, and it had already spread too far. Dominic Russo paced his dim office, rage twisting his features. He slammed his fist on the desk, growling, "Someone close betrayed us." His eyes narrowed on family portraits, the silence heavier than stone. Outside, storm clouds gathered, echoing the turmoil inside. Loyalty felt like ash in his mouth. The truth gnawed at him. Betrayal was not from enemies but from blood. He whispered, "Family eats family." The words clung to the smoke-filled air, sealing his dread. In a candlelit room, Marco confronted his sister, Isabella. Her eyes shimmered with secrets. "Tell me it isn't you," he pleaded. She smirked faintly, silence louder than confession. Marco's chest tightened as thunder rattled the glass. Blood ties felt like chains now. Detective Sarah studied new files. Elena gave her. Each photo screamed betrayal, hidden meetings, coded ledgers, familiar faces. She muttered, "It's inside the family." The revelation chilled her blood. The empire was crumbling from its own foundation. Victor dragged a beaten soldier into a warehouse, fists clenched. The man screamed, "It's not me!" Victor's silence was terrifying, but doubt flickered in his eyes. He realized the truth. The betrayal was higher, closer, and deadlier than anyone feared. At dawn, Dominic gathered the capos in a smoke-filled chamber. "We bleed because of betrayal," he declared, his voice sharp as glass. Silence followed. Every stare across the table carried suspicion. Family unity was gone. The war had truly begun. The storm broke at twilight as Marco Vital entered the family archive, keys shaking in his hand. Dust swirled like ghosts around ancient ledgers and locked drawers. Isabella waited by the window, her face calm, her eyes like knives. Marco said, "Tell me why our father died for this." She smiled without warmth. "Legacy demands sacrifice." He opened a safe and found contracts stamped with foreign seals and initials of ministers. Payments flowed through shell trusts and art shipments. Isabella said, "The throne was rotten, so I cut it out." His breath caught as he saw his own signature on a transfer he never made. She said, "You were my masked brother." Rage flared, then terror, because the ledgers named living kings beyond their city. Marco whispered, "We were never the players." Isabella said, "We are pieces moved by an unseen hand." Lightning flashed, revealing a red dot sweeping the glass. She said, "They are listening." The power behind them had noticed the noise. Detective Sarah Miller studied a decrypted drive. Elena delivered inside a hollow book. Sarah said, "This is bigger than Moretti." Screens mapped routes from ports to consulates and hedge funds. Elena's voice trembled. "They used my husband as a courier for ministers." A spreadsheet linked weapons to relief charities and diplomatic bags. Sarah's jaw set. They built a choir of saints to sing for sinners. Offshore trusts hid beneath museums and foundations. Elena wiped her eyes and said, "Every ribbon cutting was a blessing for blood." Sarah called a federal contact, then ended the call when the line clicked. She whispered, "We cannot trust the badge." The drive showed Isabella's code name and a meeting at a coastal estate. Sarah said, "We go there tonight." Outside, sirens thinned into wind. Inside, a truth settled like iron. The hidden hand wrote policy and obituary in the same ink. Victor stood beneath an overpass where the river smelled of rust and secrets. A bound courier knelt in the mud, shaking. The order from Dominic was simple: break the link. Victor lifted the man by the collar and saw terror that mirrored his own nights. The courier said, "I carry messages for men with flags, not guns." Victor frowned as a convoy rolled past above, government plates flashing. His code had always been obedience, yet the road above hummed with sanctioned corruption. He said, "Who pays you?" The courier whispered, "Your masters." Victor saw a photograph pinned inside the courier's jacket, a child with missing teeth and a ribbon. He lowered his fist. Rain thinned to mist as conscience cut through habit. He carved the bonds and said, "Run west, then disappear." The man sobbed and fled. Victor faced the river and admitted a truth. Breaking this chain required breaking himself. Dominic Russo entered a private club paneled in walnut, where power wore cologne and silence. A senator waited with a banker whose smile held no blood, only numbers. Dominic said, "You used my house as scaffolding." The banker sipped. "Your house was profitable." The senator said, "We need stability, not kings." Dominic felt the floor tilt as he realized his empire had been a rental. He said, "You ordered the bullet that killed Moretti." The senator shrugged. "We ordered a transition." A waiter placed a pen on a folder marked with sanctions and relief grants. Dominic read a clause that turned soldiers into contractors and capos into donors. He said, "You launder sin with law." The banker replied, "Law is the cleanest water." Dominic signed nothing and left his ring on the table. The door closed on applause from a room that never heard gunfire. The coastal estate rose from cliffs like a verdict. Wind tore at cypress trees and scattered gulls. Sarah, Marco, and Elena watched guards cycle patrols along glass corridors. Sarah said, "We lift the veil or we die in it." Marco checked a hidden recorder and whispered, "We expose them, not just bleed them." Elena steadied her breath and said, "For the ones they buried with smiles." They moved at the lull between shifts, hugging shadows that smelled of salt and stone. Inside, portraits of donors lined a hall like saints who charged interest on miracles. A conference room glowed at the center, its screens alive with roots, votes and tariffs. Isabella entered with men whose wealth softened their footsteps. Sarah said, "Tonight, we catch the hidden hand writing." Marco pressed record as doors sealed, and thunder rolled beneath the sea. The war would not be won with bullets alone. Wind clawed the cliffs as the coastal estate glimmered like a blade. Sarah Miller led the way through a service corridor, her voice calm. Sarah said, "We move clean and quiet." Marco Vital checked the recorder and nodded. Marco said, "We take proof, not trophies." Elena kept pace, jaw set against fear. Elena said, "For the names they buried." Glass walls revealed a conference suite, where donors' portraits stared like idols. A screen displayed roots, votes and tariffs, braided into one web. Isabella entered in a black dress, followed by men whose ties matched their power. Sarah whispered, "The hidden hand signs in gold." The recorder blinked red as a guards patrol shifted. Lasers crept along the floor like red ants. Marco said, "Window is seconds." Elena eased a door and slid them inside shadow. The sea boomed beneath, as if the world itself demanded witness tonight. Alarms murmured from somewhere deep, soft as a held breath. A guard stepped from an alcove and froze at the sight of them. Sarah said, "Hands up and walk." He reached for a panic key. Victor appeared from the stairwell like a storm in a coat. Victor said, "No noise." The guard lunged and met a wall of muscle and regret. Metal rang once, then fell silent. Marco exhaled hard and checked the hall. Marco said, "We are burning time." Elena planted a relay behind a console and watched lights dance. Elena said, "Doors loop for 90 seconds. Footsteps grew louder, heavy, and trained. Sarah pointed toward a side gallery veiled by velvet. Sarah said, "Through the donors." They slipped beneath painted smiles and gilded frames. Outside, the sea hurled itself at stone. Inside, a fuse hissed toward the heart of the empire. The conference doors parted with a hush like a confession. Isabella stood at the head of the table, glass tablet in hand and eyes like winter steel. Marco stepped forward, breath shaking. Marco said, "Sister, call it off." Isabella smiled as if at a childhood prank. Isabella said, "I called it on." Screens bloomed with maps and signatures that bled into policy. Sarah raised the recorder toward the ceiling mics. Sarah said, "Say it again for the people you bought." Isabella's gaze slid to Elena and did not blink. Isabella said, "Your husband carried our flags?" Elena flinched, then straightened like tempered wire. Elena said, "He died carrying your lies." Isabella tapped the tablet, and the door sealed with a soft kiss. She said, "You came for truth and found leverage." Thunder climbed the windows, as if to join the argument. Marco's hands opened, empty and shaking. A hidden door opened, and men in quiet suits entered with a silver-haired patron at their core. His accent carried passports and elections. He said, "Transitions need shepherds." Dominic Russo stepped from the opposite side, rain on his lapels and fury in his eyes. Dominic said, "You hired wolves," and called it policy. The patron glanced toward the recorder and smiled like a curator. He said, "Artifacts." Victor moved to block advancing security, shoulders squared to history. Victor said no further. Batons rose and met a wall of bone and will. Sarah slid the relay onto the main console. Sarah said, "We stream to open channels." Elena braced a door with a steel wedge. Elena said, "Make it loud." The patron lifted a hand to kill power. Dominic slammed his ring onto the table like a gavel. Dominic said, "Let the world hear the minutes." The stream went live as files unfolded across mirrored screens. Contracts, roots, and donations braided into one indictment. Sarah said, "Every signature is a wound." The patron reached for a fail-safe and found nothing left to kill. Isabella watched the tide turn and kept her poise like a queen on thin ice. Isabella said, "Choose, brother." Marco stared at her and at the world outside, where the sea roared like a jury. Marco said, "No more crowns." Victor staggered from the melee, bleeding but standing. Victor said, "Hold the door." Dominic stepped aside, eyes hollowed by truth. Dominic said, "Let the house fall." Alarms rose to a scream as sirens approached from the road. Sarah raised the recorder and did not tremble. Sarah said, "This is the end of silence." Thunder answered, and the estate felt suddenly smaller than the truth it tried to hide. Sirens braided with thunder as the estate locked down, doors stuttering under battering rams. Sarah Miller steadied the recorder, face pale but unshaken. Sarah said, "Hold the stream until the lights die." Marco Vitale scanned the exits, heart drumming. Marco said, "North stair, then the cliff path." Victor braced the door with his shoulder, blood dark on his sleeve. Victor said, 6 more seconds." The silver-haired patron watched the screens unravel his dynasty, and smiled thinly. He said, "History edits tapes." Dominic Russo met his gaze, and felt the last of his illusions crumble. Dominic said, "Not tonight." Elena slipped a drive into her coat, and nodded to Sarah. Elena said, "If they cut power, I carry the fire." Alarms hit a pitch that shook the glass, and the first SHIELD team breached. The truth had entered the room wearing boots. The breach split the room, scattering figures like cards. Isabella stepped through the chaos untouched, black dress unruffled. Isabella said, "Choose me or lose everything." Marco felt childhood memories flicker and fall like embers. Marco said, "I choose the dead." Sarah pivoted toward a side console as power dimmed to gray. Sarah said, "Back up uplink now." The patron signaled a guard to cut the fiber. Victor intercepted, moving with a grim patience learned from confession. Victor said, "No more errands for kings." Dominic lifted the folder of contracts and held it to the window. Dominic said, "Sunlight." A flashbang bloomed, and silence rang like a bell. When hearing returned, the uplink held steady. Elena whispered a prayer not for mercy but for witness. Authorities flooded the corridors like tidewater, orders crisp, rifles steady. The patron extended his wrists with a diplomat's smile. He said, "I will be home by morning." Sarah recorded his words without looking at him. Sarah said, "Say hello to the archives." Dominic set his ring on the table and stepped back from the life that forged him. Dominic said, "I am done paying." Victor sagged into a chair, breath shallow but measured. Victor said, "I stand until they count me out." Marco watched Isabella study the route still glowing on glass. Isabella said, "Cut one head and the market grows 2. He lowered his eyes and felt the cost of truth press bone. Marco said, "Maybe we cut the market." Elena walked past her, gaze unwavering. Elena said, "Some ruins do not rebuild." Dawn unstitched the storm, laying a gray veil over the cliffs. Vans ferried evidence while reporters gathered like gulls. Sarah handed the master drive to a federal team, whose badges felt lighter than trust. Sarah said, "Lose this and the city remembers your names." Dominic watched his men taken in quiet lines and felt no urge to rescue ghosts. Dominic said, "Let the bones rest." Marco signed a statement that burned like salt, then looked toward the sea. Marco said, "No thrones left to chase." Victor refused a stretcher and walked beside the gurney anyway. Victor said, "I will answer for what I kept." Isabella, flanked by agents, turned once toward her brother. Isabella said, "The third hand remains." The words fell into the surf and vanished, but the chill stayed. Night returned like a verdict, quieter than the one to come. Sarah walked alone beneath a dead billboard, the phone in her pocket buzzing with offers and threats. Sarah said, "Justice is a season, not a day." Marco drifted through a shuttered arcade where childhood prizes gathered dust. Marco said, "I am done pretending crowns are toys." Victor sat on a church step and counted breaths, each one a ledger entry. Victor said, "I will make room for the living." Dominic closed the door of an empty office and left the key on the sill. Dominic said. Let the city write a new book. Elena placed flowers at a small unmarked grave and folded the past into quiet. Elena said, "You are seen." A phone rang in the dark beyond the streetlights, patient and insistent. Sarah did not answer. The war was over. The cost would keep calling.